This is the third in a series of 4 workshops, and our presenters highly recommend attendees attend all 4 workshops to get the most out of the educational series. All 4 workshops are being recorded, except for the smaller personal discussions that are taking place during breakout rooms. So if you're unable to attend one of the live streams, please be sure to look for the recorded session on our Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion SharePoint page. The link to the recordings from the first 2 sessions have already been distributed, so hopefully everyone here has had a chance to watch those sessions if they were unable to attend. At the end of the 4th workshop, Roger will be posting a link to a feedback survey. Please take a moment after all of these sessions are completed to give us feedback for the presenters and for the DEI committee. But I am delighted to welcome back Rakeem Washington and Kasia Rutledge, and will now turn it over to them.
Thanks, Judge Long. Good to see everyone again. Welcome. Good afternoon. This is, as Judge Long says, number 3 out of 4. And so I think we'll get right into it.
Today, we're going to start out with some, continue with some key concepts. 2 of them, hopefully, we'll get to today. And then just flagging for you next time that the last workshop will be together. We're going to do some practice. And I know that makes all of the introverts like myself on the call cringe and nervous, but it's worth it. Come back. Don't skip the practice.
It's the best part. I'm an introvert also, so I do delight somewhat in not having to participate in that part of it, having others do it. And we've made it accessible for everybody. So there's a lot that comes from that shared work together. Okay, we left off, we talked a little bit about edges of learning. We've talked about the Dr. King quote and why bother. Ultimately, part of this work really involves us leaning into these spaces with curiosity, and more importantly, curiosity starting introspectively, curiosity about ourselves. How do I create the worldview that I have? Well, what went into that? Where did I learn what I learned about race in particular? We're going to start with a concept called racist versus non-racist versus anti-racist. Many of you probably have started thinking about what that means in its entirety, but we're going to watch a video together to help us explore a little bit more about this concept and how it plays out in the real world. So video coming up here soon. It's only about 2 or 3 minutes. We'll watch that together, pay close attention to some of the things that stick out for you, because we'll open up the space in a large group to have that conversation when the video's over. And as a quick caveat, there is some mention of sexual assault middle of the video. It's not in any detail whatsoever, just a word is used, but we still share that with folks that you have full awareness going into the video. Okay, reflections, anything that comes up for y'all as you watch that video, any of the imagery or any of the words shared there. Here's another question, and maybe this will get conversation flowing here. Anyone see the imagery of the iceberg sort of cleaving apart, falling into the water, and have that stir something for you? A couple comments in the chat. Passivity is inertia and solves nothing. Need to get to action. Silence equals being complicit. Kasia, sometimes we talk about an exercise we won't do today, but in regards to that connection to the imagery of the iceberg falling into the water.
Yeah, so not going to have you do this full out today, but just think through it with me, which is sometimes we have people pull out a piece of paper and a pen. Again, don't do that part. And if I were to say, despite the enormity of the work that needs to be done on climate change, despite how the work that needs to be done is personal, it's corporation, it's business, it's government, it's international, despite the enormity of all of the intersections of that, the things that me and my family do on a day-to-day basis to help eliminate our contributions to climate change, you would write the list fairly quickly. You would say things probably like, I turn lights off when I'm not using them. I walk when I can, I recycle, I drive a Prius, I use recycled materials. I have one of those things installed in my shower that makes the shower like less pleasurable, but saves the whales, right? I suffer through paper straws. Like, you would have a whole list of things that you would be able to very quickly write down of things that you have institutionalized in your family and your life. Now, if we said, flip the paper over, And despite the normativity of racism and white supremacy, despite the interpersonal company, business, and government connection, despite 400, 500, 600 years of institutionalized racism, the things me and my family do on a day-to-day basis to help eliminate our contributions to racism, you would write, I read books, I have a Black Lives Matter sign in my yard, right? That this is a lot shorter. It's a lot harder to come by for most of us. And it's more intellectual or thought-based and less action-based, less embedded. So it's an interesting concept to think about why we have learned to find home in our homes for the work of doing climate change mitigation and work, despite the normativity of it, despite the interconnectedness of it, but don't always find home for anti-racism work in the same way.
Also in the chat, folks making that connection to the Dr. King excerpt from Letter from Birmingham Jail, and how that space of inaction is actually the bedrock for more violent, obvious, overt forms of racism. Those things don't exist without that foundation of silence and inaction.
One of the thoughts that I have is that the people who are often out trying to actually take steps and make change are the people who do not necessarily have as much power in our society, and that it's important for those of us who do have power, who aren't as affected by it, to use that power to help them or to help everyone.
Yeah. Thanks for that, Judge Long. Also, sometimes folks will see this video and equate anti-racism work to protest and demonstration, and protest and demonstration is a subset of anti-racism work, but it's not the entirety of it. There are lots of small things that need interruption every day. There are lots of conversations around the courtroom, around the dinner table, on the Max, in the grocery store. There are lots of things that need interruption, and that is anti-racism work also. As we talked about in our first session together, being in this space and ready to learn and lean into these conversations with one another can be anti-racism work too. So I'm sort of thinking about the large universe of where we can lend our energy, or as Judge Long said, the power that we have to help support others, and also to be on in the midst of it ourselves as part of the way we think about how we can commit to that action. Julie says, white fragility prevents us from talking about racism in an open and honest way that doesn't connect our self-worth with our self-perception of not being racist. So I really like the term non-racist as a tool to speak in white moderate circles. Thanks for that, Julia. One thing I'll add to that to sort of expand on that, because I think that's a good entry point to this part of the conversation. Part of what I think you're getting at, Julia, we've been taught to think and talk about racism the wrong way. There's hundreds of years of us being conditioned to look at it from the wrong perspective. The question at the beginning of the video is, are you racist? And I don't think that's the right question. And here's what I mean by that. We've been conditioned to think and talk about racism as a dichotomy. On one side of that coin, it's a false dichotomy. And on one side of that coin is the idea that racists are bad people. I'm not debating that. I'm just saying that's one side of the coin. On the other side of the coin is where the dissonance starts to occur. Because most of us, when we asked ourselves a question, am I a good person? 99.9% of us on this call, Kasia without coffee might be that 0.1. Sorry, Kasia. Could be me.
You're not speaking things that are not true. You're just only speaking truth, Rakeem.
So 99.9% of us would say, or ask ourselves, am I a good person? We're going to say yes. I take care of my friends. I take care of my family. I try and do good work in the community. Like I'm in spaces where I'm doing the best I can as a human being. Like I'm a good person. Based on that dichotomy, it means that we can't be racist, because racists are those bad people. And I've just told myself that I'm a good person. So I can't ever do those things. I can't ever participate in that action. The better question to ask ourselves is not, am I racist? The question we should ask is, what am I doing in any moment in time? What does my actions right now in this moment say that I'm doing? And what we'll find is there is a spectrum of action that goes from racist, non-racist to anti-racist. And as human beings, we move on that spectrum all the time. I may be in the morning fully committed in the midst of anti-racist action, and then something comes up later on in the afternoon that is completely antithetical to what I was doing in the morning. Maybe I have a weird thought that pops into my head. And so I've got to ask myself, like, where on earth did that idea come from? What happened there? Like, the goal is not to be a person. There is no destination to get in this space. It is to just be more fully committed to doing anti-racist action as often as we can. And once we think of this as less of a noun, who we are, and more of an action, what am I doing? It takes some of the shame that comes with those conversations out of the picture. The more we practice thinking about this as an action, it becomes then ownership of your movement, of how you show up in the world, and less about the judgment of who am I, who are you as a human being. And once we get there, we actually can start to have real conversations about racism, anti-racism. So Julie, I appreciate that comment in the chat there. Thanks for that.
I like the example that you used of the small times to interrupt. The more I know, the more I can do. I want some more tools. I'm hoping to learn them. That's really the desperate, we've learned tools to do recycling. In my background and who I am to this point, have learned more tools, but I want more. So, I mean, that's kind of a plea. Thank you. I mean, I just need to find a way to do that.
Yes.
But I am trying consciously in my work, in the moment, as much as I can.
Appreciate that. That also sets us up to say again, make sure you all come back for the last session, because we will be going over those tools. So that's a nice way to give us an opportunity for another plug for that session of practice, because we'll be talking specifically about how do we interrupt, how do we disrupt those things when they happen, whether they're bigger things or more likely all of the small things that we encounter on a day-to-day basis. How do we get ourselves in the mix?
And the thing I'll add to that just briefly, and we'll go over this a lot more in depth next time as well, is that there is no one way to interrupt racism. It is dependent on the situation. It's dependent on how much juice you have that day. It depends on your positionality. If you're a white person or a person of color, it depends on the power relationship. But the key for that we try and help people internalize is that doing nothing is what we've been doing for quite some time, right? Moving away from it, choosing that negative piece, the absence of tension, the not being sure, not being able to do it perfectly, so we don't engage. We know that doesn't work. We've been doing that for quite some time. That leaves folks of color to be responsible for all of it, right? The results of racism and now fixing it. And so trying something, being curious, trying something, not getting stuck in perfectionism, not getting stuck in shame or guilt about not having the exact right words, being creative and willing to just try and then go, I didn't do that the best way. It's all right. Next time I'll try something different. But we've got specific tools to help you kind of get to that. But the key is these are muscles you got to build. And it takes some time to build those muscles.
Cassie, you have a story to share.
Oh,
with
that's
us.
right. Thanks. If you were wondering why there are pictures of hot peppers and onions on the screen and what they have to do with anti-racism work, nothing except to remind me that I have a story to tell. So I love cooking. Those of you who know me know this well about myself, but I didn't learn how to cook until law school, really. And I picked it up in law school because law school to me felt very like nothing was ever finished. I didn't know if I was doing the right thing, if I understood contracts. The answer is no, I don't understand contracts. If I was able to do anything. And so cooking was like, you find a recipe, you buy the ingredients, you make the thing, you wish that you had added more hot peppers or more onion, which are always the answers in my book. You clean up and then you're done, right? So it became concrete for me. And because I'm an annoying type A lawyer type, like some other people on the call, I got kind of good at it because I overdo everything. And because of that, some folks have asked me over the years to donate meals for auctions and things. And so a couple of years ago, I was asked to donate this meal for a lawyer group. And it was a 15-course meal for about 15 lawyers, maybe a little more than 15 lawyers. But I have this tiny little public defender house. So there was no way I was going to be able to do it and host everybody in my house. So the person who was in charge of the auction said, come to my house. I've got this big, beautiful house. We can do it here. I've got all the plates and cutlery and all of that jazz. Great. On the day of the event, I showed up at her house. She was a white woman and had two friends join me, both who were law students at the time. Now they're lawyers. And one was an Asian American law student and one was a Pacifica Islander law student. We were in the kitchen, cutting, chopping, preparing all day. I am not a clean cook, as type A as I am in terms of like energy and like getting things done. I am the exact opposite in terms of being able to keep things clean. Cannot do it. I'm terrible. I've cooked in Rakeem's kitchen a lot. He can attest to this. Horribly messy cook. But at some point, and I say that to say at some point there was like a tiny little fire maybe in the oven that was not really my fault. I think it was somebody else's fault, but whatever, it was on my watch. So at some point during the course of this dinner that I was doing, the host of the party came in and said, hey, Kasia, don't worry about cleaning up the dishes, because we were going to clean dishes between each course. And she said, I got the little Japanese girl from around the corner to come do it. And when she said that, all of the things that happen in my body when racism is said or presented to me happened. My stomach turns into like a lump, like a rock. My chest gets really tight, like it's hard to swallow a little bit. My face turns bright red and my ears do this kind of wah, wah, wah sound in my head. I used to think that all of those physical sensations were sensations for me to get up and go out, like an uncomfortable leave. But as I shared with you in my story from last time, now I know those things are signs that I need to stay, that I need to take a deep breath and center myself and engage. And so I was about to say something, and then this little voice in the back of my head, we'll call it whiteness, was like, well, maybe now's not the right time. Maybe it wasn't that big of a deal. I mean, you did light her stove on fire. Maybe there's a different way of doing this, right? And so I didn't say anything. I said, thanks for letting me know. And we proceeded on, made the meal, served the meal. A couple of days after this, dinner's over, we're doing one of these trainings and this story comes out of me. As you were probably aware, stories just come out of me now. And somebody in the workshop said, what have you done since then, Kasia? And I was like, oh, right. Negative peace, absence of tension, me moving away from it doesn't actually do anything to dismantle the racism. I still have an obligation and an opportunity to do something. So as part of what I did, I called both of my friends and said, hey, I need to apologize to you. The host of the party came in and said something racist and I froze. I didn't interrupt. I didn't say anything. I didn't do the right thing and I'm really sorry. One of my two friends who was there helping me to cook said I did not hear it and it probably wouldn't have bothered me anyhow. You had me processing about 20 pounds of Brussels sprouts and all I cared about was keeping my fingers. And the way I move through the world is by letting those things slide off. My other friend said, yeah, I heard it. And I heard your silence, Kasia. You are somebody who claims to be anti-racist. You're somebody who does anti-racism trainings for a living. And you said nothing. And I knew in that moment I could no longer trust you. So no happy ending to that story. I chose my comfort and the comfort of another white woman over doing what I knew I needed to do, over being the person I wanted to be, over doing the thing that I spend hours on Zoom calls helping people navigate. I picked my comfort and her comfort over all of that. And because of that, I hurt people of color that I care deeply about, who are friends of mine, who are members of the legal community, who are people who were helping me in that moment. I share that story in that same spirit of vulnerability and humility we've been talking about, because it is in those moments where we find our way into doing the thing that's a problem that we can learn together how to do this differently, collectively. So we're going to put you in small spaces together. We want you to think about a time where you didn't do the racist thing, but you heard racism happen, whether that's at a grocery store, whether that's at a family dinner table, courtroom, wherever it is. You heard somebody do or say something racist and you didn't take any action. If you would like to be in a BIPOC space with other folks of color, particularly now that you know what the prompt looks like, please send me a chat now telling me that so that I can create those rooms. And if you need me to put your eyes and your ears together in a room, also send me that private chat as I'm setting up these breakout spaces. Might take me a minute depending, and Rakeem's gonna maybe talk to you, if that's okay, about positionality in this exercise.
Yeah, we'll just take a few moments as Cassie's preparing the breakout rooms to talk about a couple concepts. One, remember positionality, right? Who we are as human beings, especially when we're isolating race. Our racial identity is really important in this conversation. There are different reasons why folks don't act. Like, I may choose to be less committed to anti-racism action in a moment because I've been doing it all morning and maybe I'm out of gas. Maybe by the time lunch comes around, I just don't have any more energy for it. Or maybe the consequences for me as a Black man in that position are way more significant than they are for a white colleague to do the same interruption. And it's up to one of my white colleagues to move into that space. Or maybe there is some anti-immigrant sentiment in my community that is connected to racism that I haven't fully unpacked yet. I don't understand how some of those ideas I've actually adopted in my own experience. And I've got to spend a little bit of time of figuring out how did that racism get into my community through the loophole of anti-immigration sort of ideas. I mean, lots of ways in which that might show up for me. So keep in mind that as you're having that conversation, everybody's going to enter that from their own unique individual perspective, from your own positionality. And it's an important part of that conversation. Also, there may be a few folks that are still thinking, I'm not even quite sure what the thing is that happened in Kasia's story. I'm not sure if I even know where the racism is. If that is something that crossed your mind, ask yourself, how come I can't find it? What is it about my own worldview that means I can't spot where that racism is in that story? And do a little bit of reflection on that. And then when we come back, we can unpack that a bit more. Need a little bit more time, Kasia?
I think I'm okay.
Okay. One last thing well, maybe, you know what, I'll share that for after the break or after the breakout rooms.
And I saw in the chat there an ask about what I might have done differently. We'll unpack that when we come back.
Non-racism, that idea of non-racism is actually very consistent with racism, because what you're saying is, I'm comfortable with the status quo. I'm too comfortable to do anything differently than what we have in front of us. And we know what lives in front of us. We know what this society brings. We know what this country's history is, right? That inaction is actually just saying, I'm too comfortable to do anything different than what I normally do. And so I'm okay with whatever racism is happening around me. We use that term non-racism as an entry point to talk about it. But in reality, we're talking about racism or anti-racism. The middle ground that we think might exist is actually very consistent with the underpinnings of racism, as we've talked about before.
And I would just add briefly to that, Rakeem, that living in a space where our the natural reaction we have to be ashamed or feeling guilty or regretful about not doing something, that that space, unless we do something with that, is just part of the cycle that keeps us in not doing things, right? Like, I don't know how to do it perfectly, or I missed that opportunity, so I'm not going to try the next time. So what I try and do in my body is to take the times I screw things up or miss opportunities, learn from them and use it to propel me forward to try something next time. messy as it is. And if I were to think about what I might do differently, we'll get to some specific concepts of how to interrupt next time and tactics, but one of my go-to tactics is to ask questions. And so I think if I had it to do over again, I would have just said, thanks for letting me know. Thanks for allowing us to be here. And I know we've made a huge mess of your kitchen. Question, you just said in the course of what you about tonight that you had the little Japanese girl come to do the dishes. I'm curious why you chose that phrase. Like why did you choose that? And I would have just used that simple question to begin in a conversation with her about why she chose words, to build kind of community and connection, and then been able to do some unpacking with her. But I think just simply starting the conversation by asking a question would have been how I'd done it. Imperfect, not beautiful, but started the conversation to build. So the last one we have for today that's going to really set us up to think about next time is how does this impact all of us in ways that are pretty constant and in ways we don't even know that they're impacting us. So we are going to use this study that we like. Some of you may be familiar with it. In 2014, Nexton's Leadership Consulting decided to do a study, an experiment. They wrote a memorandum and with the help of some law professors, and they sent it out to 60 different law firm partners in the New York area. They intentionally inserted errors, 7 spelling and grammar errors, 6 substantive writing errors, 5 errors of fact, and 4 analytical errors. In this study, everything was identical. The memorandum, start to finish, was completely exactly the same, except half identified that the author was Thomas Myers, 3rd-year associate, NYU Law School, Black. The other half said Thomas Myers, NYU Law School, 3rd-year associate, white. And they sent this out to these law firm partners and said, we'd like to have you help us gauge the quality of writing of somebody who graduated from our law school 3 years ago. Please review this for errors and give us your feedback. They got roughly equal responses back for white Thomas Myers versus Black Thomas Myers. If you have been following along at home, you will know or not be surprised at all that white Thomas Myers got a significantly better score than Black Thomas Myers did. Exact same paper. White Thomas Myers received a 4.1 out of 5, whereas Black Thomas Myers only got a 3.2 out of 5. When it came to finding errors in the papers, those folks who reviewed Black Thomas Myers found significantly more of the errors than those folks who did white Thomas Myers paper. 3.9 out of 5 factual errors versus 3.2 for white Thomas Myers, 4.9 out of 6 technical errors versus 4.1, and a whopping 5.8 out of 7 spelling errors versus 2.9 for white Thomas Myers. When it came to qualitative comments, the comments were quite different as well. White Thomas Myers got positive terms like generally a good writer, but needs to work on, good analytical skills, and has potential. Black Thomas Myers got comments like needs a lot of work, average at best, can't believe he went to NYU Law School. Formatting was not part of the thing that was asked for the law partners to review, but 41 of the 53 responses weighed in on the formatting of Black Thomas on either of the papers. Black Thomas Myers, though, was substantially more likely to get comments on his formatting, 29 of the 41 edits versus 11 for white Thomas Myers. And then lastly, the key takeaway from this is also that there was no significant correlation between the grading partner's race or gender. So Black, brown, female, trans, and non-binary judges, not judges, law firm partners found more errors for Black Thomas Myers than white Thomas Myers. The only difference was that female partners tended to find more errors and wrote longer narratives than their male partners. And the reason for that is an entirely different training.
So as you all are listening to Kasia sort of share the results of this study, there are probably a few folks on the call, and this was me too at some point when I first heard this. The first thought you had was, sample size probably wasn't large enough, or maybe there's a standard deviation error somewhere in there, or maybe they didn't norm the study properly. It's just racism, right? And that may be the first thing that comes up into our minds. And we've got to ask ourselves with some curiosity, why is that the first thing that comes up when I hear this study? If that was the thing that popped up in your head, why did that come up when it did? The answer for the disparity is racism. But the question we have for y'all is, what sticks out to you in the study? What things are you noticing? What's underneath it? What connections are you making?
You mean as
Yeah, go
basic
ahead.
as perceptions of intelligence and ability based on race
Yeah,
or
keep-
something?
yeah,
There's something to us that's pretty magical about the way that the study was designed and what it reveals. We have, when we work with different communities, we've got this study done with real estate and education and medicine. So it's not a unique study, but there's something about the study reveals about the way that racism is so ingrained in us that we like. I think that's what Rakeem's asking about. And any other thoughts you have.
Connor's in that spirit of vulnerability saying, I hate to admit it, but I was like, where's the control group? That was the first thing that came out, right? Julia saying, reminds me of all the times I've heard Black folks say they need to be better than everyone else just to be seen as equals, right? When you hear folks of color say, I have to work 2 or 3 times hard just to get the same opportunities, just to get my foot in the door, just to get the promotion, this is the type of thing we're responding to. It is sometimes harder for white folks to see what that means. And we're not going to talk about invisible labor. We won't have time for it. But part of that is there's a lot of extra emotional work and energy that takes to not only do all of the same things, but to do them in the face of constant racism, right? To have that thrusted into your space all the time means you have to deal with that and still show up in ways that that your colleagues do, and prove yourself to be even more efficient, better, harder working, just to get those same opportunities. Thanks for that, Julie. Barb saying, reminds me, there's lots of studies about how just changing the names on resumes changes who's get thrown in the trash and who's get sent forward to HR. Folks of color or folks with Black, brown, indigenous sounding names more likely to have their resumes dismissed just by the name alone. And then Danielle talked about something that's really important too. In this study, there is an over scrutinization of Black Thomas Meyer, right? The reviewers spend more time and energy perceiving and thinking there will be errors in the paper, so they go hunting for them, so to speak. There is also at the same time an under scrutinization of white Thomas Myers, the presumption that those errors don't actually exist, so the less willingness to go looking for them. And in that differing levels of scrutiny, even though it's the same exact paper, you see how there's a stretch, right? There's a stretching of how they perceive both of those papers based on who they are. I'm trying to get my hands on the screen. In that stretch is the disparity. We don't always know how that's playing for us. It's sometimes very hard to see when we're doing it, but it exists, and that bias lives in all of us.
Yeah, just the thing that I love about this study so much is that for me, the only difference between these two papers and how they were perceived was the internalized racism of the people grading them. And so, like I think Rakeem said this, if for example, if it was a hiring decision, they would have hired white Thomas Myers. And they would have felt very confident in their decision to hire white Thomas Myers. And they would have said, we hired him because he had less spelling errors, he had less grammar errors, he wrote better paper, he definitely formatted his paper better than Black Thomas Myers did. But in reality, none of those things are real. All of those things were them missing the errors in white Thomas Myers' paper and giving the benefit of the doubt to white Thomas Myers, but requiring Black Thomas Myers to work 2, 3, 4 times as hard and still not even make it to the place where his paper was considered equal. And we can tell that because of the relationship between the pattern of errors they found or didn't find, and then how those showed up in the qualitative comments. The comments about white Thomas Myers and Black Thomas Myers were not just, they were about him as a human when it came to, or him as a student, or him as a lawyer when it came to Black Thomas Myers. Average at best, can't believe he went to NYU Law, versus good writer, needs some help with these things, right? And so that is important to me because it helps me find my way into what are the ways in which I am giving both grace to folks, to white folks, or the ability to make mistakes to white folks, and then at the same time holding folks of color to a higher level of accountability that I don't even know that I'm doing.
Yeah, and also in that, Kasia, imagine for a moment I am Black Thomas Meyer, and I get this feedback, and I reach out to folks to say, hey, I'm trying to improve my writing. Can you tell me a little bit more about, compared to everyone else you saw, how you saw my writing? They're going to respond by demonstrating and showing all of the errors that existed in my paper, right? They're going to show me those errors and say, oh yeah, shoot, I did make those mistakes. Okay, I need to fix those. I'm going to now internalize the way in which they had over-scrutinized my paper, because my paper is no different than white Thomas Myers, but now I perceive that that person has written something better than I did. And over time, those messages become internalized to the point of where it can lead to self-doubt, or some folks of color know the term imposter syndrome, thinking you don't belong in spaces that you actually do and that you're very well qualified for. It comes from the way in which we internalize these subliminal messages about race without even recognizing that's what's happening. And even further, to Kasia's point, if this is a hypothetical about hiring, imagine the same process unfolding, HR doing a review to say, why did you hire this particular person? Finding that Black Thomas Myers had all these errors in their application, and then feeling very justified for hiring white Thomas Myers. Meanwhile, never getting to the real root cause of the problem, which is the implicit bias of the interview panel, which means we never actually root that out. We always place that discrepancy in the hands or in the bodies of the Black and brown folks through the application process. So much so that over time, this interview panel will more likely than not continue to overlook folks of color in hiring processes till we get to the point where we say, there's just not a lot of folks of color here. I wonder why that is. Must be something external to us because we're doing the best we can here. Must be the region, no one wants to be in Oregon, etc. But there's actually a lot of that decision-making that has to do with the way we do things. And so if we don't have a process to actually examine, like, where is this coming from and how is it getting into our systems, we only replicate them, even though we think and say and acknowledge that we have implicit bias. If we don't change our actions or behaviors, or are thoughtful about how that shows up in our spaces, our courtrooms, our desks, our offices, our mediation tables, all we really do is reinforce it in a very subliminal way. I think maybe a good spot for now, until next time, is just a little bit of reflection on this concept of false objectivity, of that idea of bias. I know it's a topic that many have probably thought through and shared conversation about. It doesn't hurt to continue that conversation. Continue thinking about and trying to identify, how do these ideas show up in the work that we do in the spaces that we're in? And then when we come back, we'll get to that action that we've been dangling out in front of y'all for the last 3 sessions.
And just want to, as we go into the weekend and go into the last session, acknowledge that an hour over lunch with people on Zoom is not the ideal way to do all of this. So we know it can feel kind of quick and it can feel incomplete, and it's kind of the nature of this format and where we are. But I put our emails in the chat, and we would love to connect with y'all outside of this. If you have questions, want to unpack things, please do reach out.
And thank you, everyone. Please be sure before the next session to encourage everyone in your departments to listen to watch all of these last videos if they haven't, and to join us for the very exciting What Are the Solutions session that's going to be coming up. And thank you all so much.
Take care, everyone. Have a good week.
Take care.
Be well.